The job site monster.ca did a survey a while ago, and they asked the question, why do you work? And they surveyed a bunch of people and asked this question about a lot about stuff about work. I'm going to reference some of those things in just a second here. And they asked, why do they work? Well, there was one answer that was by far and away the number one answer, and you know what it was. What was the number one answer, do you think? People responded, why do you work? Money. You have money, absolutely. That was the number one answer. But there were some other reasons. Some people noted personal fulfillment or purposefulness in their life. And so in Canada, this survey was done. It was published by monster.ca. And actually, it revealed that job satisfaction, people's work in Canada, is very important to them. For instance, it said that 24% of Canadians love their job. They do it for free. I don't know if any of the MDC faculty was involved in this survey. I highly doubt it, actually. But that's actually a pretty high percentage. Almost a quarter of Canadians said that they love their job so much they would do it for free. 40% said that they really enjoy what they do, and 29% said they like it well enough for now. Maybe this isn't the job I want to do for all my life, but for now it's a job that I like. That actually, compared to other countries, was the highest in the world. About 83% of Canadians expressed some level of satisfaction with their work. That was higher than in most other Western countries. It was higher than the United States, India, France, Germany, the UK, all of those places. None of them reported that high of a satisfaction with their work. Only 2% of Canadians said that they hate their job. Or another 5% said that they didn't like it. So that's a very small percentage of people who actually really said, I really hate my job, or I really don't like my job. I think in some ways what this reveals to us, it may be somewhat surprising in some ways, because sometimes we reveal or we think of work as, at best a necessary evil, or at worst a drudgery, because after all, as Stan mentioned, alluded to this a little bit last week in his message, more and more we see work as not what defines us, but rather our leisure as what defines us. We work to play. We work so that we can make money, so that we can do the things we really like to do. But actually, I think that this survey reveals something true about people's feeling about work. Work is important to them. Work we know has something to do with creating meaning and purposefulness in our life. And so at a deeper level, this survey, I think, reveals to us that work is meaningful for Canadians. And the question then is, how do we find meaning in our work? If work is important to us, we want work to be meaningful for us, what's the key to finding meaning in our work? Because that's a different question in some ways than do you enjoy your work, or do you like your job? Finding meaning in work goes deeper and is different than than those questions, although they're certainly valid questions. Now, just by way of definition, when I talk today about work, what I'm talking about is that could be different for many of us here in this room. So when I'm talking about work today, what I mean is that sort of your answer to that question when somebody asks you, so what do you do? For some of you, many of us here, it would be, I'm a student. And that's right now your work. For others of us, it's that I'm a teacher, or I work at McMaster Divinity College doing this job. And that's kind of how we would answer that question, what do we do? For some people, it could be I'm a stay-at-home mom. That's what I do for my work right now. For others, it might be I'm retired, but I volunteer doing this. And so our work is sort of that which takes up a large part of our life. So let me ask you, why do you work? And how do you find meaning in your work? Well, I think the Bible offers us some ways to think about work, as we're going to explore throughout this year. And that's a bit of an ambitious title there, Work in Biblical. This is maybe a partial biblical perspective that I want to offer today. But I think work, as we read from the passage in Genesis, is intrinsic and it's related to our being of being created in the image of God. Now, as many of you know here, what does it mean to be created in the image of God? Well, lots of books and have been written about that, and lots of debate has gone on around that. But the image of God is a key idea in Scripture because it was a key idea in the ancient world. So some of you may know, this little guy is it's a artifact. It's a picture, or it's not an artifact. It's a statue of the god Baal. Baal, of course, we read about Baal in the Old Testament and in the ancient world. As some of you would know, if you were a Baal worshiper, there was a high degree of likelihood that you would have one of these guys in your house somewhere, probably in a prominent place. Having something that represented the image of your God was an important part of your religious worship. So you would have the statue of Baal in your house to remind you of him, to maybe believe it would have some kind of maybe power to bring you good fortune in your life. But signifying your allegiance to Baal by having an image of him in your house was an important part of your practice of your religion. Now, that's one of the radical realities, of course, of Hebrew religion, of the Hebrew scriptures, and of the Hebrew faith. That we read in Genesis chapter 1 that God imbued humankind with his image. And that's why we also have the teaching in Scripture that you don't create images in the Ten Commandments. You don't create images because a graven image like the one we just looked at, Baal, has no place in Hebrew worship because the image of God, the representation of God, is made manifest somehow through the human being, through the fact that we somehow bear God's image. Now, what it means, I think, to be created in the image of God maybe has multifaceted meanings. But in the context of Genesis 1, I think it has to mean at least one thing. It has to mean at least that being created in the image of God means that we are created to be creative beings. Because Genesis 1, as we know, is all about creation. It's all about God being creative. It's all about him doing stuff and making things happen, bringing the world into shape. So when it tells us that we're created in his image, somehow that has to mean that we are created to be like God as creative beings, that we're called to participate in the creative activities of God. And as we do, we somehow therefore reflect and manifest his image that we have been imbued with. Genesis 1 reminds us that to be created in the image of God is to be a creative being. And then we're given a little bit of a finer point to that, I think, in Genesis chapter 2, where we see the great story in Genesis 2, 7 or 8, the image of God forming the human being, the man from the dust, and breathing into his nostrils. God shares his very life with human beings. And then in verse 15, God gives the human being gives the man stuff to do. He tells him in verse 15, it says, "Then the Lord took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to till it and to keep it." The man is given creative work to do. To reflect the image of God, he's given this creative work to steward and to participate in the ongoing work of creation. Because the scripture Genesis tells us that God creates the world, he forms it and shapes it, and he makes it good. But that doesn't mean it's made perfect. That doesn't mean there's not still stuff to do. There's stuff that still needs to be done in order for the creation to be formed and shaped and brought into what it's fully intended to be. And that's partly the work of partnership between God and humankind who are created in his image. So creation and being created in the image of God is central to our understanding the meaningfulness of our work. We're created in God's image and therefore created to be creative beings. Now, a second thing, and this isn't exhaustive, of course, but a second thing is that work is part of our participation in God's work of redemption. So we know that shortly after the opening after creation and after we read Genesis 1 and 2, we come to Genesis chapter 3, and the fall takes place and things change. And lots of things do change. But It never tells us that we still don't bear the image of God. And in fact, that still remains to be true. And we also know that as the story continues to unfold, human beings are called to be intrinsic participants in the work that God is doing in the world, that work of redeeming creation, of redeeming humanity, that human beings have an intrinsic role to play in that. That while God, the fall changes things, God does not reject the world. In fact, God continues to be at work in the world, and he calls human beings to participate in that. So when we come to the New Testament and the Gospels, and we find Jesus comes to somehow manifest and to represent who God is and what God is doing in this world. The Gospel of Matthew tells us in verse 23 of chapter 4 that Jesus went through Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and sickness among the people. So Jesus has an interest in and a mission to proclaim the good news, that God is at work in the world, that God's kingdom is coming, has come, and then to demonstrate the coming of that kingdom by healing people and casting out demons, by addressing the brokenness of the world, the maladies that destroy human life, and the systems and spirits that manifest themselves in ways that bring decay and injustice into the reality of human life. And Jesus has come to proclaim the good news of God's kingdom coming and then to demonstrate that. And then, of course, he gives that mission to his disciples and ultimately to the church. We're called to participate in this idea of the expansion and cultivation of making the world right, of bringing God's kingdom to bear in our context. That's what we're called to participate in. And how we approach our work is part of that. There's this great little piece from one of Eugene Peterson's books. Peterson is a pastoral theologian and author, and he wrote this memoir. It's a beautiful little book. It's not a little book, actually. It's fairly substantial, but it's a beautiful book to read. It's a book called The Pastor. It's his memoirs from his life, mostly as a pastor. And in one little passage from the book, he talks about his upbringing. His father was a butcher in a small town in North Dakota, or South Dakota, sorry, one of those two. And he talks about his father's work in his shop. And he writes this, he says, "My father greeted each person by name and knew many of their stories. I always knew there was more going on than a commercial transaction. My father had an easy smile and was always gracious, especially with the occasional disagreeable customers. Alicia Conrad, who was always fussy about the leanness of the bacon. Gus Anderson, who made my dad trim off any excess fat from a steak before weighing it. Everyone felt welcome. He gave people dignity by the tone and manner of his greetings. 2 blocks away on the side street, there was a brothel. There was always a good bit of talk on the street of the whores and the cat house and the red light district that was the blight on the street. But not in our place. When these women entered our premises, they were treated with the dignity of their Christian names. I remember 3 of them, Mary, Grace, Veronica. When they left with their purchases, there was no gossipy moralism trailing in their wake. They were in a safe place." That's Peterson's dad participating in the redemption of creation, of taking his work and understanding that in his work he's participating with what God is doing in this world, bringing his kingdom to bear in particular contexts. So our work is a part of us expressing God's image in us, the creative image of God that we all have as part of image bearers in our life. And it's also part of how we participate in his work of redemption. So just let's think together for a minute, if we can, about some of the implications of this for our lives and our work. First, I want to say that our work, obviously based on these things, has implicit meaning. Too often, I think we seek meaning in our work in the way that we hope that our work will deliver to us some kind of fulfillment, some kind of satisfaction. And that's normal and natural, and I don't think it's wrong to do that necessarily. But in my experience, in my life, what I've found is that that's a moving target. Sometimes I feel really fulfilled in my work, and I feel really purposeful and joyful in my work, but sometimes not so much. It can depend on the day sometimes. It can depend on the season of life that I'm in. Work can bring meaning to our lives, but sometimes it doesn't. That, I don't think, is the key to finding meaning in our work. We find meaning in our work as we understand it as being connected to us being image bearers, to us being participants in God's redemptive work. Our work has meaning not because it provides some kind of personal fulfillment, although sometimes it does, and that's great when it does, but work has meaning because it connects us to the creational purposes of God and tells us that our lives have meaning, whether or not we like our job or not. Our lives have meaning because we're connected to what God is doing in this world. You don't have to love your job to find meaning in your work. Meaning is intrinsic to our work as we understand ourselves as being creative image bearers and participants in God's redemption. Secondly, our work is part of our spirituality, and it brings us into relationship with God and His purposes on earth. I think work ultimately is discipleship. God gives us stuff to do, meaningful work or work, because it's all a part of His way of shaping and forming us and discipling us into the image of Christ more fully. Now, often that's because work brings us into contact with people. And being with people has a way of shaping and forming us if we're willing to let that happen in our lives. So God gives us this work to do partly because it brings us into experiences with others and experiences with ourselves that have formational opportunity in our lives, and it's because God wants to shape us. Work ultimately is a form of prayer and worship. Work is a way for us to engage with God. It's a way for us to worship God and to be in relationship with Him, even as we go about our daily business. In sort of a way, this kind of is one example. I remember this kind of thing came clear to me one time years ago, not that, a few years ago, when I was a pastor. And there was this guy in my church. His name was Bob. And Bob was a great guy. I love Bob. He was a farmer, and he was a good farmer and a good guy. But Bob was the kind of guy who in the church, if there's anything that needed to be done, he would show up. You know, if there was work, so if something that needed to be fixed or built or cleaned or whatever, that kind of stuff, he would be on top of that. He was also an usher. You know, he was there every Sunday, and he loved to help usher, and you know, he liked to work. He liked to be busy doing stuff. But Bob was funny. I remember this used to bug me about Bob a little bit at first, because whenever we would be together in worship on Sunday morning, and we'd be just like we were a few minutes ago, singing worship songs and stuff like that. Every now and then, I'd sort of out of my corner of my eye, I would catch a glimpse at Bob, and Bob wasn't into it at all. You know, he'd be folding bulletins or, you know, doing something, or at best, or he might just be standing there like this. You know, everywhere we go, oh, Lord. And Bob would be completely unmoved. And it bugged me. You know, I thought, like, Bob, come on, get into it a little bit, sing a little bit, come on. But Bob wouldn't, you know, I don't never remember seeing him really engage in that way. And it bugged me a little bit, you know, like, come on. But as I got to know Bob better, it became clear to me that for Bob, his work was worship and prayer. For him, that was his giving his heart fully to God. Was there a need at the church? The church needed, he would be there, and with great, you know, joy in his heart, he would do what needed to be done. I was out on his farm with him many times, and he loved it. You know, he loved to do it. He wanted his farm to be great, and he did a good job. He loved that. He loved working, and he loved being a farmer. And for him, that was a place he connected with God. And for him, work was prayer and worship. Now, he probably could have sung a few songs. If, you know, that might have been a growing edge for him in his life. But that wasn't his deep place of spirituality. It was this idea that his work was intrinsic to his spirituality. And I think it is for all of us. The work God gives us, he doesn't give us because he so desperately needs us to do that job. I think he could find someone else if he had to. But he gives us stuff to do so that we'll be shaped and formed into the image of Christ more fully and more clearly. So work is part of our spirituality. Finally, as I've already kind of touched on, our work is part of God's mission. Work is the place, in one of the places where our lives speak, where we come into relationships with people, where we have the opportunity to offer hope and care and compassion, where we have the opportunity to offer the good news of Christ in some context in which we find ourselves, or in every context that we find ourselves. Work is part of God's mission. So one more story that's sort of similar comes from the author and the artist Calvin Seerveld. And he tells the story about his father, who, similar to Peterson's father, was not a butcher, but who was a fishmonger and a seller of fish. And Seerveld tells this story about his father. He says, "My father is a seller of fish. We children know the business too, having worked from childhood in the great South Bay Fish Market in Pachogue, Long Island, New York, helping our father like a quiver full of arrows. It's a small store, and it smells like fish. I remember a Thursday afternoon long ago when my dad was selling a carp to a prosperous woman, and it was a battle to convince her. 'Is it fresh?' she asked. It fairly bristled with freshness. It had just come in, but the game was part of the sale. They had gone over it anatomically together. The eyes were bright. The gills were in good color. The flesh was firm. The belly was even, spare, and solid. The tail showed not much waste. The price was right. Finally, my dad held up the fish behind the counter. 'Beautiful, beautiful. Shall I clean it up for you?' And as she grudgingly assented, ruefully admiring the way the bargain had been struck, she said, 'My, you certainly didn't miss your calling.' Unwittingly, she spoke the truth. My father is in full-time service for the Lord, prophet, priest, and king in the fish business. And customers who come into the store sense it. Not that we always have the cheapest fish in town, not that there are no mistakes on a busy Friday morning, not that there's no sin, but this. That little great South Bay Fish Market, my father and 2 employees, is not only a clean, honest place where you can buy quality fish at a reasonable price with a smile, but there's a spirit in the store, a spirit of laughter, of fun, joy inside the buying and selling that strikes the observer pleasantly. When I watch my dad's hands, big, beefy hands with broad, stubby fingers, each twice the thickness of mine, they could never play a piano. When I watch those hands delicately split the back of a mackerel, when I know those hands dressed and peddled fish from the handlebars of a bicycle in the grim 1930s, twinkling at work without complaint, past temptations, always in faith, constantly cutting up fish before the face of the Lord. When I see that, I know God's grace can come down to a man's hand and the flash of a scabby fish knife. We all need a reason to get up in the morning. And God offers us that in part by the work that he gives us to do. The potential that our work brings us to connect with him, to bear his image, to participate in his redemptive purposes in the world in which we live. Whatever God gives us to do, whether it's in the vocation and field of theological education or the life of the church, or maybe in the public sphere somewhere, the work God gives us offers us the opportunity to participate in those things. Meaning in life is never found fully in our vocation. Sometimes it's good, sometimes not so much. It is found in an understanding that God has created us to serve as his representatives and partners with him in the ongoing work of creation and redemption that he is involved in and in charge of. When we can see life through this lens, then it shouldn't be hard to get up in the morning and see how we can contribute to the expansion of God's kingdom. Your work matters. Your life matters. Because it is intrinsically connected to the deep purposes of God in this world. And when we understand that, it changes everything.